Ch35, Everblaze. The flames are real! It was Sophie's only thought as Fitz yanked her and Orly away from the neon yellow inferno that had erupted before them. The jeweled floor cracked beneath their feet, and Sophie pulled her hood over her head, trying to shield her skin from the heat as much as possible. Where's everyone else? She managed to shout between puffs from the thick smoke. Orly pointed a trembling arm toward the raging Everblaze. No! Fitz screamed. No! 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 He ran toward the flames, and Sophie barely managed to grab his arm in time. The clothes won't protect you, she warned him. Everblaze burns everything. Even without direct contact, they could only last a few more minutes in the firestorm. But my father is finding his own way out. She promised herself the words were true as she squinted at the fire, searching for any sign of life. All she could see was smoke and flame. Orly screamed and Sophie spun toward her, finding her thrashing in pain, her shoulder covered in splotch of liquid amethyst. The jewels are melting, Fitz shouted between coughs, pointing to the walls which were starting to bubble like boiling sugar. This whole place is going to collapse. Another crack split the floor, and Sophie grabbed his and Orly's hands, dragging them toward what used to be one of the windows, but now a hole dripping with bubbling jewel. Please let us fit. Sophie begged as she charged full speed, pulling Fitz and Orly as close to her as possible. She didn't have time to think or scream as they charged through the gap and plummeted toward the ground, which was now a flaming lake of molten jewel. Sophie closed her eyes, trusting her instincts, and heard the thunderous clap as they crashed through a crack into the void. Where should we go? Sophie asked, hacking and coughing as the smoke-free air hit her scorched lungs. Fitz and Orly were too busy doing the same, but she realized there was really only one place they'd want her to take them. She pictured Oblivimir in her mind, concentrating on the shadowy field she'd seen a safe distance away as a crack split the air in front of them, and they launched back to the raging Everblaze. They tumbled across the grass, and Sophie was glad she'd picked an arrival point farther away. The flames had already spread to the bare trees along the glittering crystal path. Any minute now, the fire would advance beyond the silver fence. Dad! Fitz shouted, running toward what was left on the tower. Orly raced after him, calling for Kenrick and Tiergan and the rest of the counselors. But Sophie couldn't find her voice. She couldn't find her brain. Everything was shutting down, and she wanted to close her eyes and cover her ears and wish it all away. I found them, Fitz shouted, and Sophie could suddenly move again. She chased the sound, ducking flying sparks and jumping over sparkly purple puddles until she spotted a cluster of heavy cloaked figures. Alden raced to meet both of them, and they crashed into his arms, nearly knocking everyone over as the sobs Sophie had been fighting burst free. Thank goodness, Alden said, his voice thick with tears of his own. The flames tore me away from you, and when I tried to go back in, I couldn't get through the blaze. How did you get away? Fitz asked him, light leaping, Tiergan's idea. He was the only one thinking clearly. So he's okay? Sophie asked. Yes, Tiergan is safe, but you'll have to see him later. I'm so sorry to ask this of you, Sophie, but we need quintessence. As fast as you can. Get it. They must be planning to make ferrocym, the only substance that could extinguish the Everblaze, which needed a healthy dose of the rare fifth element. She was surprised they didn't have any already made. I'll need a stellar scope, Sophie reminded him, smearing away her tears. Alden nodded, leading her and Fitz to where the others were already working. Counselor Leora is a conjurer? Where's everyone else? Sophie asked, realizing there were far fewer people than there should have been. She was glad to see Tiergan and Counselor Tarek among them, but what about Kenrick and Counselor Emery and all the other counselors? They're working to gather the rest of the ingredients for the frism, Alden explained, as a counselor with bronze-colored skin rushed over. She snapped her fingers, making Sophie realize she must be Counselor Leora, and a stellar scope appeared in her hands. We need 24, she told Sophie, snapping her fingers again to conjure up a shuttle filled with 24 small empty bottles. Alden tightened his grip on Sophie's shoulder. You need to be very careful when you transport the bottles back. That enough quintessence to take out a few 100 miles. Great, Sophie mumbled, grabbing the stellar scope. Wait, what do you mean transport? He pulled his pathfinder out of his pocket and gave it to Fitz. There's too much smoke here blocking the stars. I've set the path to Siren Rock. Hail me before you leap back. I know which facet will take us here, Fitz said, shouldering the bag of tiny bottles as he reached for Sophie's hand. Yes, I know, Alden said sadly, but you'll need to make sure it's safe to return. The Everblaze has caught the wind and is heading toward the river. By the time you've bottled the quintessence, this whole city would be up in flames. 36 Everblaze. Warm, salty wind prickled their noses as Sophie and Fitz reappeared on a long stretch of pristine beach. The waves glowed with swirls of pink and green, but it felt wrong to be somewhere safe and breathtaking while the world was burning. How did this happen? Fitz asked quietly. I didn't even feel Finton move. How could he have cooled down Everblaze? Sophie didn't have an answer. We should get started, she said, tucking the stethoscope under her arm and reaching for the first glass bottle. She didn't realize she was shaking until the bottle slipped from her hands, landing with a soft thud in a silky white sand. Hey, Fitz said, catching the scope as she nearly dropped it too. You okay? I'm fine. But she could hear the tears rising in her throat, and now that she felt them, she couldn't hold them back. Fitz pulled her close, letting her cry on his shoulder as she whispered, Everything's going to be okay. Is it? She wiped her runny nose on her smoky singed lip. Do you think everyone got out in time? I don't think my dad would have kept that from us, do you? I guess not, but they both knew Alden was very good at hiding things. I'm sorry I wouldn't let you search for your dad, she whispered. You mean when I wanted to run into the fire like an idiot? His chest heaved with a sigh. Thank you for stopping me, and thanks for saving my life. I was way too panicked to figure out how to get out of there. Yeah, well, you saved me first. I had no idea the Everblaze was burning. If you hadn't pulled me back, I doubt I would have gotten out of there in time. I guess this proves we make a good team. A stretch of silence passed before he whispered, Do you really think Eternalia is going to burn? Not if I can help it. She pulled away and grabbed the stethoscope, remembering why they were there. A tiny spout protruded from the narrow end of the scope, and she attached a bottle and hefted the heavy gadget up to her eye. Which star do you need to find? Fitz asked, lining up the other bottles on the sand. Elementine is one of the unmapped stars. She could only find it because of the Black Swan's carefully planted secrets. She searched the sky for the 6 stars her universe assignment had taught her to look for. The list had actually been prepared by the Black Swan as a clue, and when she connected the dots between the stars, the lines pointed to an empty space where Elementine was hidden by the darkness. Wait, Fitz said, removing his cape. He tore off 2 long shreds from the end and handed them to her. Elwin still talks about how bad the burns on your hands were. Sophie could definitely remember the pain. True, the Yeti pea bomb he'd used to treat the injuries had probably been the worst part of the experience. She handed Fitz the stethoscope and tied the strips around her hands like bandages. The thick fabric should keep her skin protected, but it also made her grip super slippery. Here, Fitz said, tying up his own hands with more cape shreds and moving behind her. He cupped his mummy palms under hers, cradling the scope from underneath. Is that better? Or is this weird? It's not weird, she promised, surprised to realize she meant it. It had felt weird where she stood in a nearly identical position with Dex a few months back, but it was different with Fitz. So which way are we looking? Fitz asked, resting his arms on Sophie's shoulders. Sophie squinted through the viewfinder, tracing the trails through the stars until she focused on a patch of darkness. She could tell Fitz was skeptical as she adjusted the knobs and then adjusted them again and again, but when she flipped the switch, thick silvery starlight streaked from the sky, knocking them both backward as it crashed into the scope. Is it supposed to be freezing? Fitz asked as he carefully removed the sealed bottle. That's how it was last time, only the scope gets hot. White hot, actually. She adjusted her grip, relieved to feel only a hint of warmth seeping through her makeshift gloves as she screwed on the next empty bottle. Fitz nestled the quintessence in the sand, making sure it couldn't tip over. They worked through the majority of the bottles just as quickly, but the strain of the concentration gave Sophie a headache, and by the time they reached the final 5, she could barely see straight. Can I help? Fitz asked as she rubbed her blurry eyes. If you tell me how to find Elementine, I should be able to do the rest. It's not really something I can tell. You have to know what to look for, otherwise you'll never find it. Okay, then can you show me? Transmit your memories of everything you look at when you're finding it. I'm sure I'll be able to figure it out from there. Sophie wasn't convinced that would work, but her raging headache insisted she try it. She handed Fitz the stellar scope and they traded places, which felt way more awkward given their height difference. I think you're shorter than Biana. Fitz hissed as she stood on her tiptoes so she could see the sky over her shoulders. She always wear heels. I guess that is sort of cheating, Fitz agreed. You ready? 1 second. She opened her mind to his, then realized she'd forgotten to ask his permission beforehand. Fitz shrugged as she apologized, his shoulder blade nearly clipping her nose. I don't mind having you know what I'm thinking, Sophie. I trust you. Her cheeks turned warm. I trust you too. Then send me those images and let's finish this. Right. She tried to transmit the memories, but sending images took more energy than she'd expected, and with her mind already so tired, she couldn't seem to find enough force. But she could feel a hint of brainfush energy tucked deep in the back of her mind, and when she mixed it with what was left of her concentration, she was finally able to shove the memories into Fitz's head. Wow, that was crazy! I think you sent me all of your memories of the stars. Did I? She checked his thoughts, and sure enough, his mind was struggling to process a never ending stream of star maps. Oh, sorry. Are you kidding? I'll never have to study for the universe again. It did take a couple of minutes for him to find the information he needed, precious time they couldn't spare. But once he found it, he bottled the quintessence on the first try. I can see why you have a headache, he told her as she changed out the bottle for him. I feel like my brain started to stretch as I concentrated. Still, he bottled the last four just as quickly, and a few minutes later, they had all the quintessence wrapped in shredded cape and loaded carefully into the bag. I'll hail Alden, Sophie said as Fitz pulled out the fat pathfinder and spun the crystal. Alden didn't answer. She told herself he was just busy and that everything was going to be okay. But when they finally leapt to the outskirts of Eternalia, they found the glittering city burning wildly with Everblaze. Chapter 37, Everblaze. Sophie and Fitz sprinted toward the city, waving around rivers of melted jewel lava. Dozens of buildings had already oozed away, with more catching fire every second, and Sophie sent a silent plea into the night, hoping no one was inside. We have to find my dad, Fitz yelled as Sophie stopped and pressed her hands to her head. I know, I'm trying to track him. Her mind could trace the sound of someone's thoughts to their exact location, but she was having a hard time concentrating between the heat and the crackling and the pounding of her heart. She wished she could take a deep breath to clear her throbbing head, but the smoke was too thick and bitter, so she closed her eyes and forced herself to tune out everything except the voice she needed to find. For several seconds, she couldn't hear anything. Then Tiergan's panic, overwhelmed thoughts filled her mind. They're by the river, she shouted, cradling the bottles of quintessence as she took off downstream with Fitz right behind her. Everything burned, her chest, her legs, her eyes, but she pushed herself to move faster, wanting to cry with relief when she spotted what looked like a makeshift lab, complete with glowing beakers and test tubes and some sort of bubbling cauldron. Standing next to a white robed figure was a blissfully familiar face. Tiergan, Sophie shouted, doubling her speed. He ran toward her once he spotted her, and even though she knew he wasn't a hugger, and she was carrying a large bag of very explosive bottles, she threw her arms around him, clinging to him in the eerie flickering light. Where's my father? Fitz asked between wheezing breaths. He's safe. He went with Lady Galvin to collect the only other ingredient we need for the frism. She'd been giving us a long lecture on how we should have kept some in reserve after last time. She's right, Sophie said, surprised she actually agreed with her evil ex-alchemy instructor about anything. I know. Turgan took the bag of quintessence from her and led them back toward the lab. I'll have Kessler start prepping this. Kessler's here? Sophie asked. Where am I? Sophie asked, wondering if that meant Dex was as well. Every alchemist we could find is here, plus a fleet of gnomes who volunteered to help us distribute the frism. The fire should be out quickly once we have what we need. Sophie hoped he was right, as she felt better handing the quintessence over to Kessler and seeing him immediately add some to the cauldron. He also assured her that Dex was home safe. Still, it was agonizing to stand there, watching the beautiful jeweled city melt in the flames, while Kessler stirred beakers and measured liquids, and they waited. Fitz had worn a groove into the ground from his pacing when Alden's familiar voice called, "Thank goodness you're both back," and Sophie and Fitz ran to tackle him. "I was so worried about you." Alden told them, hugging so tight. Sophie couldn't breathe, but maybe that was a good thing. Oh, why do you stink? Fitz asked, leaning back as far as Alden would let him. Sasquatch saliva was the last ingredient we needed. But we got it, a sharp voice right behind him, making them realize Alden hadn't returned alone. Lady Galvin, who looked less terrifying than usual with green Sasquatch fur sticking out of her bun, held up a large flask filled with cloudy yellow liquid. Even though it had a cork, Sophie could smell the rancid stench radiating from it. I'm assuming you collected the quintessence? She asked Sophie, stalking over to Kessler and examining his cauldron. It looks like you managed to do it without anything exploding either. Well done. Now we can finally clean up this mess. Everyone cheered when they finished brewing the first batch of frism, which turned out to be a shimmering silver powder. But Sophie didn't feel like celebrating as she watched a group of gnomes set to work dusting the first line of flames. All she could see was a destruction all around her, and she knew none of it would have happened if she hadn't healed Fintan. She closed her eyes and let the truth nestle deep into her brain. She needed to face it, accept it, own up to the reality, partially for her own sanity, but mostly because there would surely be backlash when the news hit the public. You two have had a long night, Alden said, joining Sophie and Fitz on the hill where they'd been watching. I think it's time we go home, don't you? Do Grady and Edeline know about the Everblaze? Sophie asked. Not yet. I didn't think it would be wise to involve them until the fires were contained, but now there is much to explain. Sophie met his eyes, realizing there was a deeper emotion hiding behind the stress and exhaustion and worry. Grief. Everything's okay, right? She asked quietly. Nobody was. She couldn't say it. Hated even having to think of it. We'll talk in the morning, Alden told her, offering her a hand. No, you have to tell me what happened. I can't. A lump lodged in her throat, threatening to choke her. If someone was hurt, I need to know. Lips formed one word, but at the last second he changed it to, I really think you should rest before we talk about this. Like I'll be able to sleep now. She's right, Dad, Fitz agreed. Alden looked about 1,000 years old as he sat down between them and buried his face in his hand. I don't know how to tell you this. The words seemed to swallow the air around them. Alden had told Sophie she'd been facing a tribunal and that she had to go to exile and that she had to leave her human family and have her whole life erased. What could be worse than that? And then she knew. Someone's dead, she said quietly as her mind ran through a list of names and faces. It was hard to remember who she'd seen safe and who she hadn't, but as she played the night back, she realized someone was missing. Fitz reached for her hand, squeezing so hard it probably would have hurt if Sophie hadn't already turned numb. Still, she felt a million needles pressed into her heart when Alden swallowed back a sob and said, Actually, it was two people. Both Fintan and Counselor Kenrick never made it out of the tower.